Welcome to this episode of the show. This will be our last recording for the year 2024, and I'm delighted as ever to be joined by my friend, colleague, and in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute, Yaakov Lappin. He's with me. He's beaming in from London, he's there with his family, visiting his family. I remind everybody that Yaakov and I became fast friends during our career as students in the University of Manchester over there in the UK. Yaakov, it's great to have you. You might have to carry me through this a little bit because, as some of the listeners may hear, my voice is a little bit strained. I'm just getting over something. I'm hardly the sole individual to be doing so at this time of year, but it's great to have you. How are you doing, first of all? Are you keeping well?
Yep, good evening from London, Ben. It's great to be here with you. We had a bit of a break, so I'm glad that we're resuming our momentum. I am doing very well. I'm glad to hear that you're on the rebound. That's the most
Yeah,
important thing.
yeah.
They say health is wealth, and I think that's actually true.
I think so as well. And Yaakov, I'm going to give a quick shout out to somebody you don't know and most people don't know, but his name is Oshri. He lives in Leeds. I actually used to work for his father. His father is named Kiko, which you'll know is short for Yaakov. And Kiko used to take me to work for him on the market stalls in the UK where he would sell baby clothes and toddlers' clothes. And I would work there on the weekends and during the week for a bit of pocket money. And Oshri bumped into my youngest brother, Alexander, who's in the UK as well. And Oshri expressed to my youngest brother, Yaakov, that he really enjoys our podcast, this one that we're doing now, but that unfortunately he finds me a bit negative. And so I'm going to try and be a bit more positive during this episode. But do you think I'm generally negative when it comes to my prognosis with regard to Israel and its place among the nations?
No, I think you're concerned, and that can be misconstrued as negativity. I think that you have many concerns, and you prioritize the voicing of those concerns. And so when people just hear concerns, they might think that you have a negative outlook, but I don't think you do, because people who are truly negative will not make the effort to change anything. And your entire life's work is predicated on the goal of change. And so at heart, you're not negative, you're the exact opposite. You're an optimist. And what you're trying to do is make Israel a better place, the Jewish people safer, and the world a better place. Otherwise, you wouldn't do everything that you're doing.
Yaakov,
So
this is too much. It's too much. You're just
that's
absolutely
what I think.
smothering me with compliments and with kindness. I appreciate it, and I want to give a shout out not only to Oshri but also to his brother Gidi, his sister Tali, and his dear parents Kiko and Inez. And I hope they're all well. And I wish them and all of the House of Israel a Chanukah Sameach, a happy Chanukah. And I also wish our Christian friends a Merry Christmas, a wonderful, wonderful New Year and holiday period and festive period. And with all of that, whether I be negative or concerned or anything else, I want to come straight to the issue of the day, the first issue of the day that we're going to be tackling, which is the Houthis. Now, the Houthis are seemingly building a rhythm of attack against Israel. They seem to be able to penetrate Israeli airspace here and there by way of the ballistic missile attacks and also by drone attacks. And what I'm hearing out of the Israeli defense establishment is a little bit of a surrender to the notion that we might be entering into a war of attrition against the Houthis. I'm hearing that from some folks in the Israel defense establishment, incidentally. I don't believe it's the dominant viewpoint. I'll be happy to hear what you say on that front. But I can tell you this idea of the mighty Israel Defense Forces that has just destroyed Hezbollah's capabilities, not completely, but severely downgraded those, that has really routed Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, that is in the process of what's called running the table in terms of its military conflicts with those on its borders and even further afield. The notion that the IDF would enter into a war of attrition against the Houthis of all foes seems to me to be absolutely ridiculous and cannot be accepted as a new normal. What do you say about all of that? Let's start with that. We'll get into it and then we'll move on to some other topics as well.
Okay, so let's start with a few facts. Just a couple of hours before we started recording, the Israeli Air Force launched what appears to be the largest Israeli counterstrike on the Houthis in Yemen so far. It's true, exactly as you say. They've gotten into a tempo of terrorizing central Israel. I myself have been woken up, I think 3 times this week in the middle of the night by sirens, and we already know it's the Houthis. There's no other Iranian puppet left to terrorize the people of Israel except the Houthis in Yemen, and they have been exploiting their great distance, almost 2,000 kilometers from Israel, to do this. So what we know, first of all, is that the Israeli Air Force struck military infrastructure, and I'll just share some of the details because they're quite dramatic. We're talking about Sana'a International Airport, and we're talking about power stations in Yemen, military infrastructure in Al Hudaydah, which has already been struck. That's the fuel port. Two other ports on the western coast of Yemen. So this looks like actually the largest, broadest Israeli Air Force strike. Tens of jets, refuelers, intelligence gathering planes, all the stuff that the Israeli Air Force knows how to send a very long way, which, by the way, is very similar to the distance that's required to reach Iran. But instead of going in the direction of Iran, they're going south to Yemen. So regarding the war of attrition, look, I think that the goal of both the Israeli defense establishment and the Israeli cabinet is not a war of attrition, but rather to convince the Houthis that the longer they insist on firing missiles at Israel, the more unbearable a cost they're going to pay. Now, I think the primary thing here is distance. Because the Houthis are far, because they're spread out, because their leadership often goes underground, and it's this sort of desert terrorist regime that's backed by Iran. So many of the ports that we just heard about being hit have been used to import Iranian weaponry. And the Houthis actually a couple of days ago fired a missile which appears to have had a maneuvering warhead. And that's quite significant because that makes it harder to shoot down. And it seems like the Arrow system had problems hitting that, and then the Israeli Air Force learned some lessons, and the two missiles that followed that missile were intercepted outside of Israeli airspace. So we're seeing, the last Iranian proxy on its feet directing advanced Iranian missiles at Israel, and we're seeing Israel now applying the firepower, the intelligence, and the capabilities that it has applied on other Iranian proxies successfully. It's now prioritizing that on the Houthis. I think the Houthis are going to learn quite quickly that their timing is very bad because right now the Israeli Air Force doesn't have that many missions, right? I mean, you have the occasional strikes in the Gaza Strip. That's a low tempo aerial operation. Lebanon is mostly about enforcement of the ceasefire, monitoring, but this is nothing compared to what we were involved with a month ago from an aerial perspective. So all of the fronts are fairly dormant, and that means that the Israeli Air Force can prioritize the Houthis. And I think they're going to be realizing that strategically they've done something which is not smart at all. They've angered a regional power which has already destroyed and partially destroyed, depends which adversary we're talking about, but caused severe damage to all of the other Iranian proxies, to the extent that the Iraqi Shiite militias, which are supported by Iran, have announced that they're halting their attacks on Israel because they're not interested in tasting that firepower. So that's where we're at. I think this is going to end in the same way that the other conflicts have ended between Israel and Iran's proxies. I think the Houthis are going to reach the conclusion that they should stop firing missiles at Israel.
Yeah, and also this is the reason why I find any talk about a war of attrition so completely unacceptable, because this is not a foe that needs to be kept within that tempo, within that incarnation of being a war of attrition. A war of attrition, there are many reasons that countries get into wars of attrition against either other states or other entities that are sub-states. But one of those reasons is that neither has an interest in really pushing things over the level of a give and take because of mutually assured destruction or mutually assured damage, whatever the case may be. That's not a play with the Houthis. The Houthis do not have, listen, as far away from us as they are, we are from them. And so they
Right.
really don't have the ability to storm a border such as we faced on October 7th. They, of course, don't have the ability to storm a border such as we feared we might face from Hezbollah post October the 7th. And they really do not merit in any way, shape, or form being kept in a cadence of a war of attrition. The firepower that they launch towards Israel simply needs to be brought to an end. And in addition to them being a long way from us, Yaakov, what I want our listeners to keep in mind is that, of course, if they open up a map of the Middle East, they'll see that while they may be far away from Israel, the Houthis, they're proximate indeed to the Saudis, they're proximate indeed to the Emiratis, and neither of those entities want the Houthis or any Iranian proxy to be active. So there could be a nice opportunity, depending on what the constellation is that comes about once President Trump takes office. Could be a nice opportunity to actually have some sort of an alliance, a broader alliance that tackles the Houthi threat, not only in the immediate term, but in the longer term. It's certainly in the interest of the signatory to the Abraham Accords and even the potential signatories to what Prime Minister Netanyahu has called the Abraham Alliance, which would see the Saudis come into that circle. And another thing that I think is particularly distinct about this is that you and I have gone back and forth about this, Yaakov, in previous conversations with regards to the threat of Iran. And you have said repeatedly, rightly, that Iran is not only a threat to the state and the people of Israel, but that Iran is a threat to global stability. But you've then gone on to say that you believe, you've said this in the past, I don't know if this is still your opinion, that you believe that Western democracies will come to understand that. And that's where you and I have had a split of opinion, because I don't think that Western democracies will ever come to understand that to a level that's sufficient to ensure their direct intervention against an Iranian nuclear weapons capability. That's my view to this point. That's obviously a viewpoint that's prior to President Trump taking office. I reserve judgment on that. But we've never been able in Israel to really convert the international democratic communities into a mindset of understanding that this threat from Iran is a threat that is posed towards their societies as well. Whereas I do think we can do that with regard to the Houthis. And the reason is because it is a catastrophic inconvenience, a catastrophic inconvenience to shipping routes, to trade routes, to supply chain issues. And so we might be able to engender much more of the international community's direct engagement against the Houthis and therefore bring it to a close. And again, fend off this idea of a war of attrition coming about. Do you agree with that?
So there's a lot to address there, and you made some very interesting points. First of all, regarding what I said about Western democracies, I don't recall the exact conversation, but just to clarify, I actually have no faith in the ability of Western democracies to reach the right conclusion in time about the need to activate force against adversaries like the Houthis.
See, you do listen to me, Yaakov, from time to time.
I don't even recall saying that I do have faith. Maybe I have more optimism that the Trump administration will understand the need to do that. I am hopeful that it will, but I think this is a good opportunity to point out what I believe it's a disgrace. I don't think there's another way of saying it. It's a disgrace that the Houthis have been able to shut down international trade. And when you do that, when you shut down international trade, you're actually challenging the world order. You're
100%. Nothing short of that. I just wonder whether I describe it as a disgrace or whether I describe it as a tragic joke. I don't.
The
I don't
disgrace
really know.
is the disgrace, in my view, is what the White House has told CENTCOM what it can and cannot do. My hunch is that CENTCOM, which is the U.S. military command that's in charge of the Middle East, would want to take far greater action against the Houthis because they are fully aware of the extent of the threat that they create to not only the regional order, but the whole of the international order, not to mention the economies of Sunni countries that are allied with the United States, like Egypt, whose traffic to the Suez Canal has been harmed significantly. Jordan, their only port is Aqaba, that's the Red Sea. The Saudis, which you've mentioned. And nobody's has really lifted a finger from the Middle East against the Houthis in a long time. The last ones who did that were the Saudis, and then they got hit with a U.S. arms embargo. And then they said, okay, well, we're on our own. So, I guess we're not going to be involved in this anymore. And the Saudis didn't join the U.S. task force in the Red Sea under the Biden administration, which I think is very, very telling that that's the amount of faith they expressed in the U.S.'s determination to take on this threat. So I think the Biden administration's response to the Houthis has been a disgrace. It's empowered Iran, it's empowered jihadists, it's empowered all of the wrong forces and America's adversaries, China and Russia in the world. So just the fact that Israel is once again left to be the police officer of the Middle East, enforcing, the need to shut down these jihadist Iranian puppets, and it's mostly Israel doing the work, despite the fact that the US has so much firepower available to it, and it's only using a small fraction of it, doing targeted hits on a command post, on a radar post. The US could do so much more against the Houthis. I think that's a stain on the legacy of the Biden administration, and I'm very hopeful that that will change under the Trump administration. Another point I wanted to make was a tactical one. When the Air Force goes and flies almost 2,000 kilometers, it has to do a lot of planning. It's got to gather a lot of intelligence. You need refuelers. It's obviously going to be very different from, a sortie involving jets striking the Gaza Strip, Hamas or Hezbollah or Syria. So this always reminds me of the fact that I think that Israel has got to start thinking about setting up a missile force
Hmm.
because a missile force will basically eliminate the need to wait this long to launch a response. And as impressive as the Israeli Air Force is, and it is phenomenal in my view as an Air Force, its capabilities are absolutely incredible, and we've seen those on display. But if we had a missile force, we would not need to wait even 48 hours. Once a target is identified, like a base, some of the ports that we identified as targets now in Yemen, they could be struck within minutes of giving the order. The missiles could be there on command. And the Houthis wouldn't be able to shoot these missiles down. And you're not endangering air crews. Now, I'm not saying missiles are the answer to everything. I just think they should be a complementary offensive tool in the Israeli toolkit. And I think that we need to start thinking about that, not letting jets be the be all end all, the monopoly of firepower. We should think about Israel acquiring a missile force and being able to activate that. And I think that's only going to improve our rapid response capabilities, especially against long range enemies like the Houthis. So that's just a
Yeah.
technical thing that I've been thinking about, I've been writing about, and throwing it
Well,
out
the
there.
truth is, it's been talked about for quite some time in Israel.
Yeah,
It's been discussed, but it's never gotten off the ground, and
yeah,
now would be a good time to bring that about. Of course, one of the distinct advantages that Israel would have, were it to have this missile capabilities, would be that whereas Israel is able to interdict much of those munitions that are fired towards its airspace by way of our air defense forces and our air defense capabilities that were on show during the two Iranian kinetic attacks against us, obviously on show against Hezbollah, obviously on show for many, many years against rockets emanating from the Gaza Strip. Other countries don't have anywhere near that sophistication, that level of sophistication when it comes to their air defense. And that it means that the potency of a missile capability of the state of Israel is far, far greater, not only because of obviously the tech that would go into that, but also the lack of tech in the target area. So I
yeah.
agree. I think that it does need to be brought about. And we've actually, separate from your comments about the missiles, we saw during the recent graduation ceremony of new Israeli pilots into the Israeli Air Force, we saw Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi really allude to the idea that Israel was more determined than ever to repel all threats against it. By the way, a man who I really think should be stepping aside now. This is the individual who was in situ during the October 7th massacre. I really don't enjoy hearing statements by Herzi Halevi, but he is making those statements nonetheless. And then also Tom El-Bar, the current commander of the Israeli Air Force, he spoke directly about the Houthis at that same graduation ceremony and expressed that the Israeli Air Force is ready and able to strike as and when needed. One thing that's a little bit different, Yaakov, and that's encouraging on this front is I know that Israel has had a reduced level of intelligence capabilities when it comes to bringing about a target bank for the Houthis. And it's actually being very deliberate about now establishing that so that it can go after them with all necessary vigor. Obviously, what must be at the base of any operation against a terror organization like the Houthis is sound, solid intelligence. Intelligence is always flawed. It's flawed by its very nature. But we're now putting more resources into that. That's an encouraging sign and really speaks to our determination to, in my opinion, not let this turn into a new normal. I do want to ask you one thing, though. There have been reports, and it's only reports, that David Barnea, the current head of the Mossad, believes that in order to curb the activities of the Houthis, Israel needs to start striking Iran. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is said to not see things that way. He's said to actually say, no, no, Iran is its own beast. It needs to be dealt with in its own way, and it is not the address that we need to assign ourselves to when it comes to, you know, degrading the Houthis' capabilities. Where do you come out on that discussion?
So I read those same reports, and I think that the idea of basically defanging Iran's proxies one after the other and then going after the head of the octopus is the right order. I think it's the right way to work. Because when we look at our situation right now in terms of Iran directly, and when we contemplate whether Israel should strike the Iranian nuclear program before January 20th, perhaps, before the second Trump administration comes into power, we don't have to worry about what Hamas is going to do. We don't have to worry about what Hezbollah is going to do. We don't have to take any of Iran's proxies into account. And even the Houthis, I think they're firing at maximum capacity. So we don't have to take them into account either. And that is an optimal situation to be in when you basically tear apart Iran's proxy network, which was designed to deter us, and we rip that deterrence off of us. Then we can look at Iran as an enemy state, adversary, and not have to take into account any of its proxies. And that has been the order that Prime Minister Netanyahu has insisted on since the beginning of the war. I think it's the correct strategic way to go about this. It allows us to focus resources and capabilities in an organized manner instead of spreading out. And if we can go, one arena at a time, we should go one arena at a time. And that has been how Israel has been fighting this entire war. It's not just the Houthis in Iran. If we go back a little bit in time, first of all, it was Gaza, and Netanyahu overrode pressure to immediately begin this campaign in the north. And I agree with that decision. I think that would have stretched us out, and we've talked about this.
I disagree with that
I
decision
know.
still, but it's
I,
behind us. It's
it's
behind
behind us,
us,
but
and
I'm
I
just
think that
using
one way
it.
or the other, things do work themselves out. But go on.
Yeah, I'm just using it as an example to look at a wider pattern, a deeper pattern that Netanyahu has. His tendency is to do one arena at a time. And I think that that's correct. I agree with that, and I think it has proven itself as an approach. And I think he's if this is his position, I think he's right to insist on that here as well. The Houthis are a threat. Let's take care of that threat, and then after that, there's nobody standing in between Israel and Iran. There's just nobody there. And that is a collapse of the Iranian proxy strategy, the Iranian proxy approach. Just for that to have collapsed is a huge blow for them. And now I think they're going to be seeing the Houthis taken off the board as well.
Yeah, it's not really a collapse of it. It's more a distraction of it. A collapse is a little bit more passive than what's happened. We have destroyed it. Israel has destroyed it. It's even better than a collapse. We've done so, as you said, in Gaza. We've done so. I don't think it's destroyed in Lebanon. You know that I'm not comfortable with the state of the ceasefire against Hezbollah or against Lebanon at this time, but it certainly is not the potent threat that once it was. I want to move to Iran now. So is your opinion that we may be coming close to the moment where Israel does actually do what it needs to do in order to take out Iran's nuclear weapons program? I cannot think of a better time for us to do so. From any and every perspective. Let's go through a couple of them. Firstly, you have a situation whereby Iran's number one deterrent, Hezbollah, has been massively downgraded. Part of the reason that we were said to be unwilling to launch a kinetic attack against Iran's nuclear weapons program was that at the point of us doing so, they would unleash or give the word to Hezbollah to unleash at full force Hezbollah's rocket capabilities against Israel. That is no longer at play, certainly not even close to the level that once it was. So we're free of that constraint. In addition, you have the flight path now that is a lot more simple. You spoke about the distance and the complexity of launching an attack against somewhere as far and as distant as Iran. You don't have the considerations of the air defense capabilities that were inside
Yep.
Syria. You don't have the Russian Air Force flying around all over the place there. So there's more of an open flight path for us to do what we need to do with regard to Iran. And you also, of course, don't have the Iranian proxy that is Hamas and anywhere close to its functioning terror military capabilities that existed prior to October the 7th. And then you also have you still have a lame duck period. We're still in a lame duck period. Quite frankly, it's another discussion, but I'm not entirely sure who's governing the United States of America at this time. You have a president who was deemed unfit to run for re-election, and you have a vice president who doesn't seem to be doing anything whatsoever and who doesn't have a mandate from the people. So I'm not quite sure who's governing, but during this lame duck period in the United States, there would be a good opportunity for Israel to go forward and to launch whatever strikes it needs, whether that be kinetic strikes, cyber attacks, intelligence attacks, on whatever level. There are many, many ways in which this can be done. It's not all about flying our birds over there and detonating all of these capabilities. But I would like to see it happen because in the final analysis, that which took place on October 7th is not going to reach, in my view, full resolution without us cutting the head of the octopus, and that octopus is, of course, headed by Iran. What do you think?
So I think that this is actually the biggest strategic question and dilemma currently facing the Israeli cabinet. If I had to, arrange the headlines around what's really the most important issue right now, it's this. It's whether Israel is going to make the decision to pull the trigger and send the Air Force in Iran's direction by January 20th or not. And I think that in light of all the publicly available information, the correct decision would be to attack the Iranian nuclear sites before January 20th, because the alternative to that is far murkier and less certain, right? The alternative to that would probably involve the Trump administration beginning a maximum pressure campaign, which I'm sure would be significant. The problem is that the Iranians are master negotiators, and they have successfully used every diplomatic negotiation channel as a means to buy time, to divide the US from its allies, and to basically secure legitimacy for its nuclear program. And I don't want to see that happen again. So let's look at the best case scenario, right? The best case scenario could be that the Trump administration says, look, either you, through a diplomatic arrangement, you take apart your nuclear program, send away all the enriched uranium abroad, anything beyond, 3.6% in line with the original agreement, leaves Iran, and your centrifuges are disbanded at Natanz and Fordow, and the essential components are disbanded, or the U.S. and Israel will strike, right? That's the best case scenario. And even then, I'm not sure that Iran will be contained, that it will do anything that it claims that it will, do under that kind of arrangement. They are so capable of deception, so capable of buying time, that even as an administration as determined as the Trump administration would be to set their nuclear clock back, I'm not sure that they'll be able to do it. And because the Iranians have lost all of their proxy networks that are significant and relevant in terms of the Middle East, and I'm not only talking about Hezbollah and Hamas, the Assad regime, has fallen to the Sunnis. This is a huge setback to Iran. They invested tens of billions of dollars in sustaining that regime, trying to turn Syria into a second Lebanon. And all the weapons that they sent through Syria, that's all gone. There are a whole bridge to the Mediterranean into Lebanon has collapsed. And that's a direct, effect of Israel's military achievements against Hezbollah. So when the Iranians see, that the entire region is turning against them, the one thing they have left is the nuclear program. The nuclear program is like their immortality potion. That's how they perceive it, in my view, because if they drink that potion and they do it, they break out to the nuclear weapons before anybody can stop them, then they will perceive themselves as being immortal. And rightly so in terms of external threats. Look at North Korea, look at Russia. These are countries that get to bully their neighbors, in Russia's case, launch murderous wars of invasion, and they've got the nuclear umbrella to make sure that no major power is going to attack them, is going to be very, very reluctant to attack them, because they drank the potion of immortality that any dictatorial regime can do, and that's going nuclear. And so I think the Iranians are really tempted to do that. And the Iranians, just like we have this dilemma in Israel about whether to strike before the 20th of January or not, I think the Iranians have their own dilemma. Should they try to break through to nuclear weapons or not? And I'm pretty sure that dilemma is playing out in the Iranian halls of power as we speak, and in Israel's decision-making forums. The dilemma of whether to strike or not is taking place. So I think these are very dramatic times.
But as great
Yeah.
negotiators, Yaakov, the Iranians will well understand that one of their most potent negotiating cards has gone, namely this idea that they can unleash their proxies against Israel in the event that Israel or the international community should seek to strike their nuclear weapons program. And that could, of course, induce them to race for the bomb with greater intensity and greater speed, which is why time very much is of the essence. And the Americans will understand that. The incoming Trump administration will understand that. And of course, Israel will well understand it. I think it's going to be interesting because we're at that point that's known as money time. I mean, I've personally had conversations with successive heads of the Mossad, former heads of the Mossad, former heads of the Shin Bet, former chief commanders of the Israel Defense Forces, and I've asked each of them, does Israel have the capabilities to end Iran's nuclear weapons program by way of a kinetic attack? And each of them, all of them, have said without reservation, yes, it's merely a question of political decision making. Now, how much stock do we put in that? People can decide for themselves, but there really isn't any higher authority to which one could appeal for an answer on that issue. And I've had access to those people. You've heard some of those interviews, you've heard some of those conversations. I know that you have your own sources as well that are very, very considerable. But it really does seem to me that now is the time where we're going to see the resolve of leadership. Do the leaders want to get this done, or do they think that they're unable to get it done? The security establishment has been almost unanimous for many years now that they can get it done if given the order to do so. So we'll wait and see what's going to happen with that. I want to turn to
Yeah.
the issue of the hostages, Yaakov, because we cannot forget that. So look, the hostage crisis is an ongoing crisis. It's another crisis where time is of the essence. I think about our hostages, elderly, infirm, even the more robust among the hostages, going through a second winter at this time in awful conditions inside the Gaza Strip at this time without any clarity as to whether or not they will be released imminently. And I think to the hostage crisis that took place under the Carter administration. And when Ronald Reagan came to power, I believe on Inauguration Day, that hostage crisis was resolved by the return of the hostages. I would very much like to see the same happen when Donald Trump takes up office on January the 20th, although it does bear mentioning 3 weeks until January 20th approximately is a very long time when you have hostages being held in an active war zone inside the Gaza Strip, as I mentioned already, with varying levels of health and sturdiness. Do you think that we're going to see all of our hostages come back by January the 20th? I actually listened very closely to an interview that incoming National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who I think is an excellent appointee by the Trump administration, gave to Ben Shapiro. And in that interview, did you happen to see it, incidentally,
Mhm.
Yaakov? Did you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, in that interview, Mike Waltz said that anybody, I'm paraphrasing here, but what he said a lot, but one of the things that he said was that anybody who takes American hostages needs to be prepared for a response by Americans up to and including a bullet in their head. Right? This is what he said openly. And what I was encouraged by that sort of rhetoric. By the way, I would think that that would go without saying, incidentally, but apparently not, given that we're coming out of the Biden administration. But
Yeah.
also, I was encouraged by that statement, but I was concerned about it as well because Mike Waltz seemed to be making a very deliberate point of confining his comments to the American hostages that are being held inside the Gaza Strip. And at no point during that 60-minute interview, approximately, did he say, and of course, that goes for our Israeli allies as well, who have hostages being kept inside Gaza. So I'm just wondering if you see any reason for concern with statements like that, or do you see reasons for optimism? And overarchingly, do you think that we're likely to have our hostages home by January 20th? I think that Israel, under no circumstances, should be entering into a negotiation that continues the drip feed of hostages. I think it has to be all of the hostages in one go, both those who are alive and those who are no longer alive, those who are defined as humanitarian urgencies versus those who are defined as not being in that category. All of them need to come home. There cannot possibly be a single hostage that doesn't fit into the category of a humanitarian urgency, they all having been held there since October the 7th. So I warned about this at the beginning of this crisis, that Israel should not enter into any phased negotiation for hostages to be returned. While I celebrate all of those who were released and all of those who were rescued, we cannot be overjoyed because there are so many who are still inside the dungeons of Gaza. What say you about it?
So, look, in terms of the comments that you referred to, I don't think there's a need to be concerned because, first of all, I think America should be saying that anybody who takes its citizens needs to be worried about their lives. I think that's a basic statement that the United States should make. And I think there's a kind of, respect that was given to Israel based on the idea that Israel is going to take care of its citizens as well. And perhaps, that's where that came from. I don't know, but it's just, a speculative thought that I have in my head. Look, regarding, the issue of all hostages, I'm unfortunately very pessimistic about any deal that's going to result in all hostages being freed for the very simple reason that Hamas is saying that the only way that they're going to consider that is by Israel leaving the Gaza Strip and letting Hamas retake the Gaza Strip. That's the whole reason that they have the hostages in the first place. It is their attempt to survive this war as a regime and to buy themselves an opportunity to rebuild their terror army. That's why they have the hostages. So if they release all of the hostages, they lose all of their leverage, and there will be nothing at all to stop the IDF from moving in and making sure that Hamas never again retakes the Gaza Strip. So I don't understand how any deal is going to result in all of the hostages being released under those circumstances, and that leads me to think about rescue opportunities for those that would not be released. Obviously, that's extremely dangerous, operationally extremely difficult, especially if they're held in tunnels. We don't know all the details, but it leads me to think about whether that might happen or there might be some attempts to reach deals independently of the Hamas leadership, which I'm sure there have been attempts to do that with, certain clans that are holding some of the hostages. According to multiple reports, Hamas doesn't even have a full list of the living hostages in the Gaza Strip, because not all of them are held by Hamas. There are other organizations, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There is the PFLP, I believe, is holding some hostages. Some of them have been outsourced, quote unquote, to clan members, armed clan members. So it's a real mess. And what I understand from the open source reports that are out there is that this deal that's on the table is a partial deal, and they're talking about something like 30 to 35 out of the
Yeah, so
approximate.
just to be clear, I have the same understanding. I
Yeah.
understand that
Oh, I
it's a partial
understand.
deal, but it's not what I would want to see. Not I don't want to see any delay in hostages being returned, of course. I think I've made that clear, but
Yeah, yeah.
I don't I am not comfortable with this notion of a phased release of our hostages. I think that it's a huge mistake. It will cause a national crisis in Israel, or the continuation of what's already a national crisis within Israel. And
Yeah.
and the idea that there are these groups that are more in higher humanitarian need than others, I can
Mhm.
understand there are those who are, as I said, at different
Yeah.
levels of health, at different levels of well-being. That of course makes sense to me. But all of them are bound for physical, mental deterioration the longer they stay inside Gaza. And so we obviously get there, and I think that get to this idea of them all being humanitarian releases. And I think that the quicker that we define them all as fitting into that category, rather than allowing Hamas to separate them out in the way that they are doing, I think the better. But carry
Yeah.
on. I interrupted you.
No, listen, I totally agree with you. I am very disturbed by what would happen to those who would not be released.
Yeah.
That's something that disturbs me. I completely share your fear for their fate. It's very hard to avoid the terrible words death sentence that some of the family members of those who would remain behind have been warning about. I fully understand those fears, and this is the problem. This is the basic problem with the dynamics here. Hamas is saying, if you want all of them out, you have got to let us survive this war as a terrorist regime and terrorist army. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet have said, no, that's not a price that Israel is willing to pay to get all of the hostages out. Here's what Israel is willing to pay. And what they have done is they've reportedly leveraged Israel's military achievements in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, against Iran, everything we've been talking about, the destruction of Iran's proxy network, that has all led Hamas to the realization that it is isolated and that its bargaining position has been severely damaged. And that is why there was a breakthrough, right? The reason that these negotiations are back on the table is because Hamas reached the conclusion that it cannot demand a full Israeli withdrawal. And that's why this whole idea of a partial deal in which Israel remains in the Gaza Strip, the IDF remains on Netzarim corridor, remains in parts of Philadelphia, remains stationed, and might redeploy within Gaza, but it's not leaving the Gaza Strip. That is what enabled this entire breakthrough. And now, by the way, we've seen new reports saying Hamas has actually gone back and saying, no, actually, we want Israel to commit, even if it's at a later stage, to commit now to leaving the Gaza Strip. And the prime minister is saying very clearly, I'm never going to commit to leaving the Gaza Strip because that is going to result in a Hamas resurgence and ultimately a Hamas victory. If Hamas is allowed to survive the 7th of October in a year and a half of war and it builds back, that is going to be extremely destructive for our continuity. And anybody who supports that idea, I think is really betraying, first and foremost, southern Israel, the people living in the Gaza envelope, people living in Sderot, and all of the people who sustained the most horrific day in our history. Anybody who's calling for an IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip to let Hamas rebuild is unfortunately, in my view, betraying the well-being and the security of those people first and foremost, and then also our entire continuity as a country. So these are heartbreaking and terrible dilemmas, ones that Hamas have very deliberately used to divide Israeli society. It breaks my heart to see how divided and fractured our society has become around this issue, how politicized it has become. We've talked about this in the past, but I think that anybody who shies away from having a cost-benefit analysis about what Israel can and cannot pay is basically saying that the security of millions of people should be guided strictly by emotions, and you cannot run a country in the Middle East if you operate that way. So that's essentially how I understand the current situation. It's very troubling. On the other hand, there is some room for optimism about at least the fate of between 30 to 35 hostages, and if they do, see the light of day soon, that's a reason to be very, very happy for them at least.
It's just so minuscule, when you think about the number that was taken, and now we're down to discussing whether or not we'll get something in
Yeah.
the low to mid 30s back alive anytime soon, and the remaining 65, 70 that are there, we don't know about, we're not sure about. This is why I really want to see whether it be aligned with reality or not. I'm sure I'm not saying anything that's particularly groundbreaking here, but I was beating the drum about this right at the beginning, that this phased release is not something to which Israel should accede. By the way, we've had this before, right?
Yeah.
We've had it before where there have been tranches of releases that were lined up that were supposed to take place. Hamas breaks the deal, and nothing happens. Everything pauses for an undetermined length of time. But I think about those hostages and whose families with whom I've worked. I think about Itzhak
Yeah.
Lipschitz, whose mother Yocheved and whose father were kidnapped on October the 7th. Both of them. I think Itzhak's father is the oldest hostage considered still alive inside the Gaza Strip. I think about the interminable suffering of course, the hostage himself. I believe it's Oded. Forgive me, I can't remember his first name, but Oded, if that is his name, and of course his wife Yocheved, and of course Itzhar and his siblings. This is an unending amount of suffering that's going on for these families. I think about Eviatal David, the brother of Eli David, and I think about him still being in captivity, the son of Galia David. And
Hmm.
I think about Galia, the mother, who we brought to America, and her ever increasing silence on the issue, really. Just not always managing to find the belief that her words can change the situation. But whenever she does find that belief, being willing to speak out again and again and again and to campaign for the return of her son from inside Gaza. And then I think about Almog Mail Jan, who on December the 10th we hosted here
Yeah.
at an event in the United States, at an event in New York. He spoke about the rescue operation Mifza Arnon that was named after the officer, the Amam officer who died in the course of that rescue operation, to bring him home from inside the Gaza Strip. And Almog said in front of a live audience something that I didn't anticipate, which was that the hostages who were being held there inside Gaza faced two very difficult realities. Firstly, the attitude of their captors toward them would change and deteriorate based upon Israeli successes inside the Gaza Strip. So if
Hmm.
Israel took out a major terror leader, if Israel took out a major piece of Hamas infrastructure, if Israel scored a significant victory against a Hamas battalion, the attitude of their captors would deteriorate and they would be more cruel and more tormenting of the hostages in real time, incidentally, in real time.
Right.
But he also said that he and the captives with whom he was living at the time inside Gaza were very much on the fence as to whether or not they wanted a rescue operation to take place because they were hearing and were being informed at various points about and of rescue operations that had failed or were foiled or did not result in the rescue of hostages coming out alive. It's an incredible set of dilemmas that,
Yeah.
that this young man, I believe Almog is 20, 21, maximum 22 years of age, was carrying with him daily. So all of those things you've alluded to, I just wanted to add a little bit of
Sure.
complexity to that when it comes to these rescue operations and their planning and also the attitudes of the hostages, given that they don't know if a rescue operation will result with success. We hope it will. It has done,
Of course.
thankfully, in some cases. There have been other cases where it's not met with the success that we wanted. So you seem to be saying that you're skeptical, you're doubtful that a hostage release deal will be struck by January 20th. Is that right?
No, actually, I'm not that skeptical. I think that it's kind of 50-50 or even 60-40 in favor of a deal. But
Okay.
the deal that, we're discussing is again a partial deal. I think that that's likely because Hamas could use a ceasefire. I think that they're thirsty for a ceasefire and they want to see if they can create the dynamics to turn that ceasefire into something that's longer term, not permanent, but something that would give them real breathing space. And that's what they're looking for. Again, this is what they're desperate for. But we have so many unknowns. Like, first of all, who in Hamas is making the decisions? Most reports are alluding to Muhammad Sinwar, the brother of Yahya,
Yes.
as the actual, terrorist commander on the ground who's making the major decisions together with his inner circle. I think that that's accurate. It's usually the people on the ground in the field who are making the core decisions and the Hamas overseas people, Khaled Mashal and those that remain in Qatar, are basically being used as messengers to deliver messages, and the communications are very irregular because of the security situation in the Gaza Strip. So that creates its own set of dilemmas. Who are we negotiating with? How much power does the Hamas overseas branch actually have? I think very little. And then you have the whole, political situation with the intermediaries, Qatar, Egypt, who appear to be competing with each other. So there's so many layers of complexities here, and it's all very, very difficult. But at the end of the day, I think that if there is enough interest by both sides, I hate to use that phrase in this context, but if there is enough interest by both sides, Israel and Hamas, to reach a partial deal in exchange for a temporary ceasefire, then it will happen. My suspicion is that that interest does exist. And so I think that there's more than a 50% chance. It's not very high, but I think it's more than 50%, I would guess, that it will actually happen by the 20th of January.
All right. So I want to just touch on a couple of final topics. Yaakov, one of those is I know that you were just inside the Gaza Strip. You were in a different area to the one where I was serving. You went down to the area adjacent to the Rafah crossing. Is that right, or was it
Yeah.
elsewhere? Just correct me if I'm wrong.
I was on the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom crossing,
Kerem Shalom
which is
crossing, right?
close to Rafah. Yeah.
Right, and that's relevant today because there's obviously this ongoing scandal, this ongoing slander. There's a famine inside the Gaza Strip in northern Gaza in particular. By the way, the usually close to silent U.S. ambassador to the States of Israel, Jack Lew, who incidentally I think has been a pretty ineffective ambassador. I don't think anything of any real significance has taken place during his tenure. I'll be pleased when Mike Huckabee takes in and assumes that position in his place. But Jack Lew has actually taken issue with several accounts from UN organizations that speak to famine inside northern Gaza, to the point where those same organizations have actually taken down their assessments and their assertions that there is a famine spreading. But you were inside. How long were you in for? How long did you go in for?
I think that we were there for around 3 hours, more or
Okay,
less.
so you went in for 3 hours into the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is where many of these aid trucks
Yep.
are crossing into Gaza. And you were actually telling me that you saw these aid trucks essentially rotting by the side of the road, right? Because while the aid is being taken in, there's nobody to effectively distribute it. Tell me what you saw. Tell our listeners what you saw while you were in there, and also what was the motivation of that trip? Was that the IDF trying to communicate to influencers and journalists and reporters such as yourself that actually there is an answer to this canard, there is an answer to this allegation, and not only can we tell you it, but we can show you it.
Yeah, that was the motivation to show that the IDF is making every effort to get aid into Gaza, and it is. So, what I saw there was very interesting. It took a while to start connecting the dots because you're just sort of flooded with information, and not all of it is very is very necessarily very well arranged. So it was up to us to connect the dots. But at the end of the day, what I was able to ascertain was, first of all, the IDF has begun a pilot program in order to severely reduce the chances or dramatically reduce the chances of those aid trucks being hijacked. Because the main reason why aid is not getting to the people of Gaza is because the trucks that get in are hijacked and the drivers can be shot. Actually, there was a driver shot on the day that we were there. We got word of that. And that's the reason why so much of the aid that you refer to as left rotting in the sun has been abandoned by aid groups because they refuse to send drivers into harm's way. And it's Hamas doing the hijacking and it's criminal gangs doing the hijacking. Gaza has become, the Wild West in that sense. And so you've got all these gangs plus Hamas stealing the aid, selling it at very high prices on the black market. Hamas uses it, of course, to feed its own fighters. And a lot of it just isn't getting to the average Gazan civilians in places like the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone and other areas where the civilians remain. So the IDF has been trying very hard, and it actually figured out one way to reduce the hijackings, and that is by sending the trucks along two roads that are under IDF operational control. One is the Philadelphia corridor, and the other one is what they call the border road, which runs north to south. Philadelphia corridor runs east to west, and the border road runs south to north. And so these trucks start their journey on these Israeli-controlled roads, which means that no hijackers are touching them, and then they turn into their destinations in Gaza. And what they found, they sent like 400 trucks in four different convoys of 100 trucks each. What they found is that this dramatically reduces the chances of hijacking, and they were encouraged by that. And they told us about that, amongst many other things. And it's not a be-all, end-all. It's not the full solution, but it's an improvement. At the end of the day, the IDF is doing everything it can under the current limitations. But the real limitation, in my view, that the IDF is facing, in addition to obviously the need to prioritize its soldiers for fighting Hamas and not for securing aid trucks, right? That's one of the dilemmas that it's been facing, is really the lack of a decision by Israel to declare an Israeli military administration. Because if Israel would do that, if Israel would declare a military administration, then it would officially take over the entire aid distribution process. And that would bring hijackings down even further. But because the government has been very reluctant to do that, and the defense establishment has led the opposition to doing that, the IDF has looked for what I call sort of gray area solutions. And it's these kinds of tactical solutions that the IDF has been trying to create. It's one step short of a military administration. It's using roads, it's trying to secure the convoys from the air when possible. These are sort of, gray zone efforts. It's not ever going to be enough, but Israel is certainly making every effort possible under the current limitations to get the aid to the people. Hamas, criminal gangs, these are the main reason why the aid isn't reaching the Gazan people. And the fact that none of this, or almost none of it, is made public, is reported on by the international media, is absolutely shocking. I cannot imagine.
How can you possibly be shocked by that? Come on. You don't mean that. You're not really shocked that the international media is blaming Israel for a famine that does not exist. Please tell me that you're beyond that, Yaakov. I just don't accept that. I don't think you're shocked at all. And if you are shocked, you should get over it very, very quickly. Right?
Let me
I
tell you.
mean, come on.
Let me tell you. I'll tell you how I see it. Okay.
All right.
The bigger problem in my view, and it's not just the international media, it could be media in any country, including Israel. There are certain facts that are so basic that have to be spelled out in
Hmm.
understanding the situation. In this case, it's the main reason why the aid isn't reaching Gazans is because of hijackings, right? That's a basic fact. The fact that that issue has been erased from the discussion is shocking because it shows that people cannot in any way trust most of the international media. Anybody who reports on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and doesn't begin that report by saying the facts are that 100 and X trucks, for example, went into Gaza today, and out of those, 50 were, targets of hijacking. I'm just throwing out an example. Anybody
Yeah.
who doesn't do that is misleading their public. And it is shocking to me that we live in an age where there's so much data available, right? COGAT, which is the Defense Ministry's agency that's in charge of publicizing this information, has on its website every day how many trucks go into Gaza, how many tons of fuel, how many tons of blankets, how many tons of food, packages, medical equipment, oxygen tanks that go into hospital. All this is listed. All this data is out there. And so we live in an age where we've never had more data available and where it's ignored, where all this data is simply ignored in favor of a narrative, right? And that to me is shocking because, it really tells you that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much data you put out there. It doesn't.
Yeah, no, no, you're right. I agree with your conclusion. It doesn't matter. I'm just amazed that you're shocked by that.
I'm
I'm
shocked
not
by
trying
the
to be
wider.
pedantic
No,
and
no, it's a good
draw
question.
on a string
I'm
that
shocked by the wider implication of this. That's not this case study, but the wider implication is that no matter how much data and facts one throws out there, it will have no bearing whatsoever on a narrative.
and
That people,
the implication for Israel is that this constant effort, this bending over backwards in order to satisfy international opinion when it comes to our right and ability and need to defend ourselves, protect our borders, defend our civilians, that all needs to stop. Not that we should fall afoul of making all due efforts to convince those who are open to being convinced, but rather that
right.
we should not overestimate the possibility and the potential of those efforts to bear fruit. What we need to
Hmm.
do is cleave ever more strongly to our own standards. Those standards, incidentally, supersede the standards of the international community in the vast, vast majority of cases. To rest easy with the idea that we are bringing aid when it's needed, that we are supplying that which is required, and to become comfortable in the uncomfortable reality that no matter what we do, it will not suffice.
Right.
Israel expressing and explaining itself to the international community falls into a dynamic that I actually hold akin to faith, to the notion of a belief in a creator, and that is expressed thus. For those who believe, no explanation is required. For those who do not, none will suffice.
Yeah, that's
It's the
true.
same.
And
It's the same.
obviously,
It's the same
obviously you're
for us.
right.
Yeah,
Obviously you're right.
unfortunately, I'm right, and you know, I think you know I'm right. I think that I
You are
don't think
right.
you're as shocked. Look at Yaakov. Not to digress, but we've been seeing this dross. You and I have seen this with our own eyes since we were student campaigners at the University of Manchester in 2000 while they were blowing up buses in Israel by way of homicide attacks at the hands of the Palestinian Arabs, and people lined up behind the idea that this was all the state of Israel's fault, that Israel had no right to defend itself, had no right to protect itself. It didn't matter what numbers we brought, it didn't matter how
Yeah.
we tried to express that these were children who were being blown apart, that these were not even Jews in many, many cases who were being killed, but just Christian members of Israel,
Yeah. But you know what that
Muslim
means?
citizens
You know
of
what that
Israel.
means? It means that this entire effort is I don't
But do
believe
you
that.
agree? You know, we've seen this for now 2 decades, Yaakov, with our own eyes,
Yeah,
right?
and
We've
it
seen
means
this.
that Israel has been doing this all wrong, because at the end of the day, if our adversaries have the upper hand because they're focusing on narrative and emotions, and we keep going back to facts, we're going to continue to lose. I'm not even talking about the mismatch between resources.
Well, you're talking, sorry, but you're talking about facts in the sense of putting out the data points, such as those that you alluded to of Kogat.
Yeah,
I think, incidentally, there are problematic elements with regard to Kogat's information, not in terms of there being a lack of reliability, but I think there's just a natural dissonance between what Kogat's able to put out and what the consumer of that information is able to contextualize. Does the average
agreed.
consumer understand how many people X number of trucks will actually feed? What the calorific requirement is that's brought in versus the calorific requirement that people need to ingest. I think most people have absolutely no means or
But they're not
ways
even seeing the
of drawing
data.
those together. Yeah, they can't possibly understand. I've brought about those briefings. I've taken very, very
Yeah,
extremely capable, learned, fluent senior commanders from COGAT, which for our listeners stands for Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories.
right.
I've brought them to some of the leading think tanks in DC, to members of elected office in the House, in the Senate. I've done that over a period of several years, several times. And there's just an obvious dissonance between the very clear information that these commanders were able to brilliantly
Yeah,
express, and the ability of folks to really digest, well, what does that actually mean
right,
in real terms? And so
right.
you're always going to have that challenge. But you're talking about facts in terms of what Israel presents, numbers, data points. I'm talking about facts in terms of what Israel achieves. I think Israel, the way to deal with the phony narrative in the international community and their false facts in parentheses is to go
Mhm.
and create facts, create successes, create military successes, and create a better security arrangement for us, because that is the only thing that ultimately is going to secure our future in Israel. And we do that, of course, as I said earlier, in line with our values. By the way, the
Our
values that we're
values and our
exporting to.
interests,
And our
100%.
interests, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there should be much more of an alignment between our values and our interests than has been in the past. So I'm very pleased that you went into Gaza. It actually makes me just perhaps for our last point for the purpose of this. But how are you for time? You have a couple more minutes, Yaakov, or
5 minutes I've got
not?
left.
5 minutes. Okay, so
Yeah.
let's just round it out on this.
Yeah.
You know, you're a husband, you're a father. Those are the things that I think that you would say you are first and above and beyond everything else. And as a husband and a father, you were weighing very deliberately the cost benefit of you going into Gaza for an embedded tour of the
Mm.
war zone earlier on in this war. And ultimately, for reasons that I well understand, you decided that you weren't going to do that because it was too hot a conflict zone, right?
In the
And
first
and
weeks, yeah,
in the
that's
first
right.
weeks of it, right?
Uh,
So now you have gone. Is
yeah.
that because you believe that the war in Gaza, in your assessment as a military analyst, as a security analyst, is the war in Gaza, in your view, no longer a war? I can tell you when I was there, it definitely was. I've said this several times. I remind you, my experience in Lebanon, in other major operations, my reserve duty throughout the
Yeah.
years. I've seen wars. I know what a war is versus an operation. When I was there inside Gaza during my most recent tour of combat duty, it was very much a hot war. No
Yeah,
question about
of
it.
course
And the
it is. I
devastation was
mean,
apparent. Now, are you now of the view that perhaps it's not a hot war, or did you just feel it was so important that you went to see it, therefore you were willing to assume that risk? And what's your mindset there? Just tell me your view.
yeah, it's worth mentioning that just in the past week that we've lost
Well, just this morning, I
four
think.
soldiers in the Gaza
Yeah.
Strip, including one this morning. Yeah, one
Yeah.
and three others previously.
Yeah.
Obviously, the conflict remains hot in Gaza. I believe that the security situation in Gaza Strip is far, far better today, despite the inherent risks and the ongoing exchanges of fire, because Hamas doesn't constitute a terrorist army, because it's been forced to devolve into a guerrilla force. That doesn't mean that it's not presenting a threat. Obviously, it is, but I think that threat is far more manageable for the IDF today than what it was 7, 8 months ago when I was presented with that opportunity. And so, in my view, there's no dilemma at all. I would take any embed that I could right now. I would go anywhere that I could with the army, and I would feel comfortable doing that. So, I think that the situation has dramatically improved, and still, obviously, there are risks, and there will continue to be risks in the Gaza Strip for years ahead. But I think that the IDF has got a sufficient level of operational control over the areas where it operates in, that I would feel comfortable going in really anywhere that they would ask me to go in with them.
Well, so you can't end 2024 without that most odious of things, predictions. You know, my boxing coach back in the UK always used to say to me, predictions are for the weathermen. But
Yeah.
we're going to engage in that very briefly. Just give me a yes, no, because I know that you need to hop.
Yeah.
So, yes, no. Is Israel going to go to elections in 2025?
Yes.
Yes.
By the way,
All
let's
right.
remember that weathermen can only predict a few days in reliably, and like anything more than a week, and their predictions are not reliable. With all the computer power that they have in satellites, they still don't know what's happening in 2 weeks.
Okay, hang on a moment. We're going to do it very quickly. So you say
Yeah.
yes, but what would be the event that would precipitate elections? Who's the component that's going to be knocked loose from the current coalition to
There are
induce?
multiple scenarios that can lead to
Just
elections,
give me
but
a couple of them as you
we could
see
have a
it.
coalition disintegration. We could have Netanyahu himself deciding that it's time. You're the political expert here. When are the elections supposed to be held officially, according
I
from this
believe it's
government?
2026 is
Right, the
when we're
beginning
supposed
of
to have elections.
26, if
Yeah,
I'm yeah.
yeah, I
Okay.
believe so.
I would bet on that happening this coming year. I don't
Okay,
wouldn't be able to
so
say when.
2025.
Yeah,
Okay,
because there are too many factors that would undermine the stability of the coalition, in my opinion.
all right. Okay. Are we going to see the broadening of the Abraham Accords? Will Saudi Arabia come into the Abraham alliance that Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about during his address to the joint session of Congress?
I think yes, but not officially in the coming year. They will broaden their involvement in Abraham Accords, but I don't think they will make it official in this coming year.
Will the war come to a close in 2025? Operation Swords of Iron. Will it come to a close?
The war will come to a close, but the conflict will continue for many, many years.
Okay. All right. Yaakov, as ever, I just want to really just finish with a prayer. I want to pray for the safety of our soldiers. You rightly mentioned that several of them have fallen in the course of their service in recent days, including on this day. So I pray for the safety of our soldiers, that they be watched over and defended and protected as they fight for our land and for our people. I pray for the redemption of our hostages and our captives, so that they and their loved ones can know some closure in the land of Israel, and we can bring this national and even international horror to a close. And I pray for the continuing wisdom and courage and conviction of our decision makers, so that they can make decisions that are worthy and up to the meeting of the challenges that face Israel and the Jewish people at this time. And I think at the elision, or at the meeting point of all three of those, lies the doorway to Shalom al Yisrael, to peace for Israel. And I wish all of our Jewish listeners Chanukah Sameach, a happy Chanukah. I wish all of our Christian listeners a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. And I would implore everybody to keep in mind that there's no place for fear. because Israel will prevail. Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live, and we are, in my view, if we make those correct decisions, perhaps on the cusp of knowing our greatest decade for many, many years, and even more than that. So, Bezrat Hashem, we will have the victories that we need. We will have the decision making that we need, and we will have the ingathering of our soldiers and our hostages and to our land. So, Yaakov, it's been great to be with you this year. Thank you so
Likewise.
much. Enjoy the time with your family. Thank you for your
Thank you.
friendship. Thank you for your analysis and your candor. And if people haven't subscribed to the show already and haven't written a review and haven't given it a rating wherever they download their podcasts from, I'm sure that they will all do that very, very promptly now, certainly before the end of this year. Thank you very much, Yaakov. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Take care.